Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour, bienvenue à l'UNESCO.
Good afternoon. Would you please be seated? We're going to begin in 2 or 3 minutes. So please be seated. There are a lot of people still standing up.
And welcome to UNESCO. Quelques informations pratiques avant.
Just some announcements before we begin the press conference. The languages of the press conference will be French on channel 1, English channel 2, and Spanish on channel 3. I hope you're impressed.
Tu veux chanter une chanson?
Check, check, anglais, test, 1, 2, 3, test, canal anglais. Test, 1, 2, 3, test, anglais, test.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous allons commencer.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin. Thank you for coming to UNESCO. Welcome to this exceptional press conference following the historic decision just taken by the UNESCO General Conference yesterday. That is the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence. I'm going to give the floor in a minute to the UNESCO Director General. Let me remind you that you can follow the press conference in French on Channel 1, English on Channel 2, and Spanish on Channel 3. Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to UNESCO. I would like to present what was just adopted by the 42nd session of the UNESCO General Conference. It is a recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, a recommendation that is unprecedented in its substance, in its scope, and its degree of precision. It was adopted by 193 member states of UNESCO. This is the end of a lengthy process that we began in the spring 2018 at UNESCO. At the time, I recall that a lot of people thought that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to come to an agreement, to find common ground amongst the 193 member states on the ethical principles to guide the development of artificial intelligence, because the subject, as you all know, is a very sensitive one. But after years of work, we have been rewarded by this important victory for multilateralism. That is a text which is equal to the challenges of the 21st century in a United Nations organization on an important subject for our future, the future of all of us. Why was this text necessary? Because of the swift development of this technology of artificial intelligence in all parts of our society and in our daily life, used by the daily services without our necessarily being aware of it, but which accompanies us every day in our decisions, in the decisions of the public and private officials, in the digital bubbles that are developing around us. It is a technology that has a lot to offer when it comes to research, medical research. For example, during the pandemic, artificial intelligence made it possible to achieve the first warning signs on the epidemiological situation. It was also used for finding vaccines and for many other useful endeavors, useful for our common good. But the technology also raises important issues. First of all, it is scarcely intelligible, comprehensible to the average citizen. It is rather opaque in terms of the nature of the data used by artificial intelligence, or in terms of the algorithms themselves and the way they work. And also because of the questions due to the digital divide within societies, but also between countries. That raises a certain number of issues when it comes to our common interest. Another issue raised by artificial intelligence is that innovations in artificial intelligence are concentrated in a rather small number of companies, which raises certain problems. That is, there are imbalances between those who work on artificial intelligence, the designers. You know that UNESCO We've had a lengthy history of work on the role of women in science as well. If you look at the figures, only around 1/3 of the researchers are women. In general, when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's even less, around 20%, according to the World Report on Sciences that we published a few months ago. And we know that in that field, there are fewer women than in the other scientific and technological fields, which has an impact on the definition of the algorithms and on their objectives, as well as the sort of data used for artificial intelligence, which also reflects political and social situations. And therefore, it worsens the imbalances that exist in political and social life. Now, given that situation and these risks, we wanted to come up with a framework of values and of principles rather precise and pragmatic and shared by the whole world. In order to have a framework in such a competitive framework when it comes to research and innovation, it had to be shared. Otherwise, it would quickly be rendered obsolete by what the others are doing. So we needed to have a precise tool, not just a declaration of values or general principles. Why did we choose this sort of instrument, a recommendation, which is one of the standard-setting instruments that a multilateral organization like UNESCO has at its disposal? We chose a recommendation because we felt that that was the best legal framework for artificial intelligence. It sets an international standard-setting framework, and it gives the member states responsibility for translating that framework into their situation. It's a source of inspiration. It's a shared reference, and it's also, and there is in the recommendation, a mechanism for follow-up that will be affected by UNESCO, but which will be monitored by all. The follow-up to the recommendation in national regulations and national legislation. Now, in the spring of 2018, as I said, we launched the idea. In 2019, we received a mandate from the member states. UNESCO received a mandate to work on artificial intelligence. In 2020 and 2021, we worked on the basis of a network of experts, 400 associated schools, 200 university chairs, a first drafting committee with 24 international experts, independent experts from all continents, and I would really like to thank them. They are the ones who laid the groundwork for this recommendation. We received contributions, more than 50,000 sent in by researchers, NGOs, by technical stakeholders and civil society. And all of that led in recent days and weeks to discussions, extremely intense discussions, up until the very last minute when the text was adopted, late November, at the UNESCO General Conference. What does the text say? Well, first of all, it sets 4 universal principles or values that guide us when it comes to addressing artificial intelligence. First of all, the respect and the promotion of human rights, fundamental freedoms, and human dignity. That is a tradition of what UNESCO does when it comes to the ethics of science. Secondly, the need to protect the environment and ecosystems. Thirdly, the need to ensure inclusion and diversity. And fourthly, to favor peaceful, just, and interdependent societies. Then it contains principles and actions, which I will come to. So it is a frame of reference. It is a master plan for all of the member states of UNESCO. For example, in the framework of gender equality, which is one of UNESCO's priorities, the recommendation says that diversity in the field of artificial intelligence must be enhanced, and that women and girls must be represented in the drafting of tools and have an equal access to the benefits of the technology. When it comes to the fundamental freedoms, which is also a very sensitive issue, the recommendation forbids any recourse to social rating and to mass surveillance. When it comes to the governance of data, the recommendation establishes rules so that each citizen will keep control over the data he or she provides and will always have access to the data and that can delete the data if they so desire. It recommends that it invites the member states to create independent bodies that can be called upon by all citizens for when requesting information or to which they can appeal to defend their rights. It also raises the question at the multilateral level of the impact on the environment, which we often forget about, and the impact of on the environment of artificial intelligence by calling for the production of innovative situations in order to reduce the carbon impact of data processing. Now, having adopted that tool, we now have the question of how to implement it concretely. We, and I did this at the UNESCO Tribune, we call on all member states immediately to implement the recommendation. Civil society should also take it up. Citizens, companies, the different counter powers. This movement is already underway. Some 20 countries have already announced, when the text was adopted, that they would begin to take measures inspired by the text. So a dynamic is underway which promises a practical implementation, or at least a virtuous dynamic that will be evaluated by UNESCO on the system and on the different national systems established in order to transpose the recommendation. So that's what I wanted to say. And when it comes to the general meaning and the objective of the work that we undertook several years ago, leading up to the adoption of the recommendation. But now the work is just beginning when it comes to its implementation throughout the world and in all countries. Let me now give the floor, unless Mathieu wants to make the necessary introductions, let me give the floor to two experts who have honored us with their presence today. Dr. Audrey Azoulay, Director for Artificial Intelligence and Data Sciences in Shutterstock and Chairman of Women in Artificial Intelligence, and Dr. David Leslie, who is in charge of ethics at the Alan Turing Institute, and of course Gabriela Ramos, who is the Assistant Director General in charge of Human and Social Sciences at UNESCO. Thank you very much. Thank you for your interest. And I now leave you in the able hands of our eminent specialists for a more detailed presentations and to field any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madame la Directrice Générale. And I want to really thank her and to share with let me just get these things out of the way. To thank her because she mentioned it was in 2018, but it was really her leadership, her commitment, one of the very first issues that she focused on, and that she gave us this very strong mandate. So I really want to thank her. She's not with us because she has a very, very tight agenda, but she has always been present in really pushing this agenda forward, and that's why we have it here as a priority. Thanks to Alessandra. Thanks to David for being with us. Thanks, Dabna, our wonderful head of the bioethics. Without you, I don't think we would have arrived here. And all the ethics team, Irakli and well, everybody. I won't mention everybody because I will spend a lot of time, but this was fantastic. Thanks to our committees. You know, we have the International Bioethics Committee, the Committee of the Ethics of Science, with Hervé Schneeweiss, that yesterday got the Légion d'honneur, and also Peter Paul Berberg, who produced the seminal, because the DG asked them to produce a report to see how much the ethics could inform the AI, and they deliver wonderfully, and they continue delivering wonderfully. And Emma Roetbak-Bloem, who is the researchers from South Africa who head the expert group. The DG has already told you what is the framework. The whole point is that we produce a very detailed ethical understanding of how we are going to use these technologies. The values are there, and I think this is really an innovation, because it's not just saying we contribute to democratic values. No, we go into the detail. What do we mean by respecting human rights? What do we mean by environmental considerations? What do we mean by human flourishing? But then we go into principles that probably you know, because it's about transparency, it's about accountability, it's about explainability, it's about taking care that people understand what is happening in this world that is replacing the real world. But it's something else, and the DG also mentioned it. We cannot just have this very broad framework. We need to go into the detail of policies, because policies matter. Policies is what's going to shape the digital world one way or the other. And it's the role of governments to develop very strong regulatory frameworks, and that's why the experts, with our support, produce principles that go into the data policy, of course, because data is everything. What you put in is what you get out in the AI world. About gender, about development and international cooperation, 193 countries. And of course, you have still half of the world without internet connection. So what are we talking about? We really need to bring them also together to benefit from it. We have the environmental and ecosystems, health and social well-being, communication and information, education and research, economy and labor and culture, of course, very core to the mandates of UNESCO, all these sectors. And it was, I also want to thank all the sectors, because they all contributed to this very important goal. Let me get into some of the principles. We cannot cover everything. I really invite you to get into the recommendation, because it's also fun to read. You will not imagine, but it's an instrument that is very interesting, and you can take a lot of substance. But one of the most interesting points that I feel, and with my experience for some years in the digital issues, is the ethical governance and stewardship. You take a look at that, this is the core. Because what we are calling is for members to step up their rules and regulations, the legislative actions, to ensure that human rights are respected in the digital world, to develop AI strategies aligned with the ethics, to develop certification mechanisms that then can be shared among the multilateral system, that they could recognize and exchange information, to strengthen up the auditing, not only the data sets, but also the algorithms, to create AI ethics officers. Very important to strengthen up the remedial mechanisms, because they are not as clear as they should. The redressing, the investigative power of institutions when there is a wrongdoing, to follow a path where you really ensure that there is a rule of law online as we have it offline. Everything is about regulation, everything is about liability frameworks, and I think this is really important, and the capacities of states, because we always know that in many sectors, in the finance sector, in the technology sector, sometimes governments are behind the markets. We need to step up the capacities of governments to deliver. Second chapter that I want to share with you is the data. Again, what you put in is what you get out. If the data is of low quality, if it is not representative, if it is just talking to a certain groups and certain profiles, what you get out is, of course, discrimination, is unfairness. And this is important because more and more decisions in the welfare system, in the financial system, in the education system, in the labor, in the employment, is being taken with recommendations that are developed by artificial intelligence. And then if you don't get an interview, who do you blame? The algorithm? No. You need to have human oversight, which is something that the recommendation is also claiming. The right to privacy, this is going to be tough, but the fact is that data should be owned by the data subjects, and they should decide how they want to use it. And this is not the case now, because the consent is not as strong as it should, and we want to have rules for consent on how do we use the data in a way that is really stronger than what is now. We avoid, well, the recommendation avoids, for example, abuse of people cognitive and emotional biases. The DG also mentioned the question of over surveillance, of micro-targeting, all these issues that are not really transparent. And then we call for open data. The UNESCO also agreed on another normative standard on open science, which is very important. We will go for working with all of you and with all the institutions that want to work with us. I'm very happy because we have two tools, the ethical impact assessment, and we want everybody to use that ethical impact assessment. I'm calling on my dear friends. I know you will be working with us because we need the strength analytical capacities to develop the ethical impact assessment that will be used, we hope, by the business center, by the business sector and the public sector whenever AI is developed. So you have the questions in terms of how representative is your data, how unbiased is the algorithm, how much you are taking care that the outcome, wherever it is really in line with what the recommendation is providing. We are going to develop the readiness assessment to support developing countries, have the capacities also to take advantage, but not only to use it as consumers, but also to participate in the development. And what we want to have is really a race to the top. This is the call of UNESCO, a race to the top. And using the recommendation to push for it with the early adopters, that is our members. I really want to thank our members. It was impressive, the way they all align. There were, of course, difficult conversations. I don't want to dismiss the fact that it's a very complicated topic, but the reality is that we have a fantastic group of members that were pushing for this, and they knew the world needs this instrument, and the Ambassador Al-Mullah from Kuwait, who was our chairman. We're going to launch the Women for Ethical AI, and I see Alessandra, and the Observatory of Ethical AI, and of course we have other works on digital anthropology. So this is it. I will give the floor to my dear friends here, but thank you for coming. Help us disseminate this. It's good news, and I think that we hope that in some years this will be a tool that everybody will recognize that changed the way we are developing these technologies. Thank you so much.
I think my phone is working. So first of all, let me thank the honorable member of ADG, Gabriela Ramos, for the opportunity of being here today to take part for this critical discussion, which we believe is a unique moment to influence technological and economical success for member states. The recommendation on ethics on artificial intelligence is definitely a practical tool and provide clear guidelines as a standard-setting instrument focusing on human rights, fundamental freedom, gender equality, social and economical justice, making stronger diversity and inclusion. Clarity is essential to support member states and companies in those states to make decisions on whether and how to invest in developing new AI technologies. Therefore, this recommendation becomes a critical framework to scope the current and the future action to achieve ethical AI. The recommendation is a symbol. It's a symbol of societal progress and a framework to establish a renewed meaning for culture. Today we refer to the Italian culture or the French culture, as many others, as an atomic representation of confined identities. On the other hand, technology is global, and we live in a globalized world where the desired, the cool, the wanted obliterates personal identity, where we risk erasing atomic cultures. This recommendation comes to the rescue with a new establishment of cultural pluralism in technology and in our globalized world, to connect, to celebrate, to represent, to include the most important human diversities, and a new unifying ground for future technological innovation. I'd like to conclude with two remarks. One as director of AI and data science at Shutterstock, and the other as president of Women in AI. At Shutterstock, we come to AI as expert in visual content and creative processes. We recently launched a new division in AI, and therefore we are highly committed to continue to augment our compliance and governance framework, which builds on 20 years of meticulous work on supporting users, customers, and contributors. In the chapter related to the scope of this recommendation, point 3.c, there is an explicit call for cultural identity and diversity to enrich creative companies. We are leveraging our network of more than 1.9 million of artists around the world from more than 150 countries to address those difficult challenges. Artists have long been at the forefront of pushing the boundaries, breaking down orthodoxies, and expanding the scope of human imagination. We should all be working with artists, philosophers, creatives, to provide feedback to the complex concept and limited categories, and using those insights to audit the AI systems and expand our creative taxonomies and representation of cultural expressions. As Women in AI, first of all, Women in AI is a non-profit organization, and I do thank to shape inclusive AI for our common future. Our purpose is to empower women to become innovator, leader, and expert in the AI field. The recommendation in Policy Area 6 precisely addresses gender equality. I want to touch on the why this is so critical. Latest studies show that women are more likely to experience burnout, much more than men. During the latest COVID pandemic, women have paid a high price in their career, forced to leave their jobs because the uneven family care, like homeschooling and much more. We know women suffer from gender bias, discriminatory behavior, uneven pay. And for those who are lucky that are still in their job, we tend to overwork, to constantly demonstrate to our counterpart men that we deserve it. Women overachievement come at a cost. Understanding the ethics of AI, it's a shared leadership responsibility. And it's a leader's mindset and practice to be fostered between technical and non-technical leaders who have influenced in including the often excluded voices and directing fair and equitable tech outcomes. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Alessandra. Thank you so much, because actually you read the cultural chapter of the recommendation and the gender chapter. So thank you, and thank you to Maria Gracia, who brought you here with the Women in AI. David.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. So we were asked to sort of reflect on the importance of the recommendation to speak in front of you today. And so what I really want to do is I want to ask you to listen to me, not necessarily as members of the press corps or as members of international or national organizations, but as impacted people, as human beings who are affected by artificial intelligence. Just a decade after UNESCO was founded, in June of 1955, the Hungarian mathematician and polymath John von Neumann published an essay entitled, "Can We Survive Technology?" Von Neumann wrote about what he called the maturing crisis of technology, a situation in which the global effects of accelerating technological advancement were outpacing the development of ethical and political self-understandings that were capable of responsibly managing such an explosion of innovation. This crisis, he feared, was creating unprecedented dangers of species-level self-destruction, ranging from geoengineering and unbridled automation to nuclear holocaust. At the same time, he puzzled that technological power, technological efficacy as such, was an ambivalent achievement, in his words. That is, the very forces of ingenuity that were creating the dangers of humanly prompted catastrophe contain within themselves the redeeming potential to benefit humanity and to advance planetary well-being. Von Neumann's reflections on the maturing crisis of technology have special relevance on this day that we announce, indeed celebrate, the historic adoption of UNESCO's recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this is for two reasons. In the first place, the recommendation sets forth an operational framework for the governance of AI technologies that puts policymakers, developers, citizens, and impacted communities in a better position to catch up with the accelerating advancement of AI. The all too common move fast and break things attitude of those at the wheel of commercial AI innovation has put the practical capability of technologists to inflict large-scale harm out of step with the values, norms, and policies that should otherwise regulate, control, and set boundaries on their behavior. The recommendation challenges head-on the erroneous but pervasive sense of technological determinism that surrenders to the perceived inevitability of an unfettered sprint in the AI innovation ecosystem to some non-existent techno-scientific finish line. Indeed, it sets forth concrete policy mechanisms, such as ethical impact assessment and inclusive, transparent, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder governance protocols that will enable societal stakeholders to rein in AI and to steer the course of its innovation in accordance with human dignity, human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democratically articulated visions of humanity's best future. In the second place, the recommendation provides a clear roadmap for designers, developers, and deployers and users of AI systems to overcome what von Neumann called the path of ambivalent achievement. That trajectory of innovation which equivocally hurdles in equal measures towards potentially unbounded destruction and to global benefit. The UNESCO framework could not have come at a timelier moment. We are at an inflection point in the evolution of AI. For better or worse, AI systems are ever more being directed at an unbounded problem space, an increasingly limitless field of potential applications. As a general-purpose technology, AI is not simply penetrating into veritably every domain of human practice. AI technologies are coming to constitute the critical cyber-physical infrastructure of connected society writ large. We are living through the emergence of a computational ubiquity. Increasingly omnipresent AI systems are flooding into the fields of healthcare, the life sciences, agriculture, ecology, energy, industry, transportation, education, communication, retail, and public administration, among others. This is presenting unprecedented opportunities for these technologies to advance the Sustainable Development Goals and to improve the provision of essential social goods and services in a globally equitable, freedom-promoting, and right-sustaining way. However, it's also presenting corresponding opportunities for the infliction of individual, societal, and environmental injury, from enabling governments and corporations to engage in mass surveillance and population-level manipulation and control, to dehumanizing, disempowering, and objectifying targeted data subjects who are treated merely as objects of classification and prediction, to polluting the environment with the immense energy drain of mass data storage, model training, and real-time information processing, to entrenching structural inequality, discrimination, and bias, and expanding global and local digital divides, to wrecking information plurality, and sabotaging the integrity of the digital public square, thereby fostering almost universal crises of social distrust, contagions of misinformation, and heightening levels of sociocultural and political polarization. All this makes clear that artificial intelligence is not simply a general-purpose technology like steam power or electricity. It is more essentially a gatekeeper technology whose producers and users uniquely hold the key both to the potential for the exponential advancement of well-being and to possibilities for the humanly prompted generation of catastrophic risks. What UNESCO's recommendation boldly sets forth is that it is the interconnected members of the human community as a whole that must ultimately choose which direction the key will turn, whether it is toward the future flourishing of our species and sustainability of our biosphere to the greatest good for all, or toward the anthropogenic realization of its most destructive possibilities, humanity's greatest bad. The recommendation does this by setting out a sober and reflective picture of potential harms while simultaneously showing not only how to avoid these, but also how stakeholders from across public, private, and nonprofit sectors can press ethical values, principles, policies, and concrete practical measures into the service of benefiting humanity and stewarding environmental flourishing and sustainability. As our species now stands at a critical crossroads, where the scaling of AI systems can either do tremendous good or create many possibilities for dire harm, UNESCO's recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence puts policymakers, practitioners, and impacted individuals alike in a better position to set society down an unambivalently positive, peaceful, and just path.
Well, nothing to add, Matthew. That was really fantastic, and I really thank you, Alan Turin, David, and Shutterstock, Alessandra. And over to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much. We will now open the floor for some questions, about 10, 12 minutes. We have a microphone here. For some COVID restrictions and sanitary reasons, we don't pass around the microphone, so if you can just walk and move a few meters to the microphone that is just here. It's just here, exactly, and so each and every one can have an opportunity to ask questions. And don't worry, after that, our experts coming from outside and our experts inside can spend as much time as you want to respond in detail to any questions you have. Please.
Hello, so I'm Joris Fioretti from AFP, the Wire. My question was about the outcome of this recommendation. You talk about principles. You've been very eloquent about what it can reach, but in the end, there is no instrument at all to force member states to actually achieve what's in the text. So what can come out of it? Why is it that good that you really seem very happy about it? But in the end, there is nothing in this recommendation that can force the member states to actually do what they promised to do. It's just a promise.
David, Alessandra, maybe you want to take a line first. I have some pretty clear idea of what Gabriela might say, but maybe it's interesting to hear from people outside.
Yeah, go ahead. No, please. It's a hot one. You take it.
No, I think this is a very important question, mainly for industry that operate in those different states, and even more those industry that are operating across different states. However, it's very important to start with some principle and give us industry and the player in this field an opportunity to understand directionally where we are going and how to implement mechanism, governance, and practice to align with this regulation. Because, as we all believe, actual legislation will come after this regulation, so it's very important for us to start to understand the playground in which we are going to operate with AI outcomes and how we will align today with compliance and respect for recommendation, tomorrow for legally complying. Otherwise, possible risk may come.
David, you want to add something?
I'll just add that I think we need to take a developmental view of the way the global environment of AI ethics and governance is evolving and is being transformed. This recommendation is the first globally inclusive statement about, as you mentioned, principles, values, policies, and practical measures. But even more importantly, what's happening along this path is the creation of normative and governance vocabularies that can then be taken up by the member states, by international organizations, which provide a kind of bridge from the initial articulations of principles and policies to the actual enforceable mechanisms of those policies.
Maybe, I'm sure, Gabriela, you will have a lot to say, please.
Well, I'm just adding, I really agree with my colleagues here in the sense that if this doesn't translate into legislative frameworks, it's not worth the paper it's written of, but it has very concrete mechanisms on how to translate what is the principles and policies into real regulatory frameworks. But let me tell you, you're also forgetting that outside the recommendation, there is a multilateral system that makes these things work. Why? Because you have peer pressure, because you have peer learning, because you have also benchmarks, because you can inspire, and because UNESCO has also been asked to document how much benefits we can have when we develop these technologies in a good way, and how much harm we can have. So all these cases of when you have harm, policymakers listen, leaders listen. The evidence cannot be avoided. And therefore, we will continue to produce knowledge to show how important it is for countries to do this. And I hope that members will be inspired. And then we will create this race to the top that I was mentioning.
Just an answer which is, yes, can you hear me? Yeah. Which is another question. I mean, you talk about member states, you talk about companies. If you just think about what happened to Facebook, which is openly promoting human rights and very nice concepts, which has been actually in very, very controversial scandals because of the use they have of their own artificial intelligence and the way they are doing it. I mean, the states are the ones who can dream of something. The companies can actually achieve it. If you see how long it has taken to just tax companies, in countries, it's been 20 years or more. I mean, now we're talking about something much bigger. How can you turn that into reality? It sounds surreal.
It's great that you talk about taxes because we did it. I think that the companies are going to pay their taxes. The fact is that the main goal of this recommendation is that the self-regulation is over, okay? That's the goal. The voluntary agreements of companies is over. The governments have the capacity to shape markets, and they should take that responsibility. And that's our goal. And I think this is when you hear that 193 countries came together to define so much detail in terms of how they're going to do it. It's again rebalancing the power because markets, governments are the ones that are going to tell how big is a big tech. They are the ones how much there is competition or not. They're gonna decide how much damage do you do to the kids or not. And they have the regulations and the legislations. And then they have the economic incentives because it's not only about controlling the downsides. I don't want everybody to go out of here and think that we are anti-AI. What we want to do is that there are more investments for AI to address problems instead of creating them, to more investments on the transition to low carbon, more investment in bringing knowledge to low-income countries. So it's a change of the business model, and it's only the government who has the rules and the powers.
Thank you. Il y avait une question ici, oui. Ah, yeah. Vous m'attendez 2 petites secondes.
Just one quick thing to add to this. I have a kind of exercise for you. I think that what you should do is sit with the recommendation, read it, and hold Facebook against the recommendation. Would what has happened with Facebook have happened if this recommendation has existed before? Think about the metaverse. What would happen were Facebook or Meta to take up these various governance mechanisms transparently and actually carry it out? I think that's really the question. It's a counterfactual rather than retrospective.
Oui, si vous pouvez vous présenter et poser votre question.
Alina Bassist and Monitor. I was, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago at the summit, also in Paris, of the Global Partnership Artificial Intelligence Organization, which is working with the OECD. They were talking exactly about the same things, and they seem to be developing the same sort of regulation and ethics. So what's the difference? Do you work with them? Isn't it overlapping? And in continuation of this question, why should UNESCO even deal with it? Because it's a subject, maybe it's not very politically correct to say it, but shouldn't be mostly countries that develop AI dealing with it, which is not the majority of member states of UNESCO?
Did you get the last point? I didn't understand. Yeah, okay. Gabriela?
No, very, very fast, just to make sure that everybody understands that we work with GPI. UNESCO is part of GPI. GPI is a research-led initiative that is not dealing with policies, and it has a restricted membership. So they have, I think, 24 countries, something like that. We're talking about 193 countries in UNESCO, and therefore I think that this makes a difference. But we will be working with them. They are developing the ethics for their own membership. That's fantastic. We're doing it for 193 countries. Countries that are in or that are out, the fact is that this is going to inform what happens in the AI world of 193 countries. So everybody's going to be listening, I think.
I think a small follow-up. We speak about inclusion and we speak about diversity. We need to reach out to those countries that are not yet investing or invested in AI, and we need to represent their culture, we need to represent their people, we need to represent the data that represent those cultures in order to create technology that can work and bring outcomes that are equal and fair for everyone. Otherwise, we are going to create such a strong and profound digital divide that those countries will never be able to catch up. So, is the right place to start in those places where there is an opportunity to reach out to so many different countries?
I think there's sort of 2 points to make with regard to your question. First is this needs to be an inclusive and multilateral effort. And so that the Global Partnership on AI is working on this, and UNESCO and the Council of Europe and OECD. This is a necessary chorus in order to advance the thinking that needs to go into the development of the regulation, the development of the governance mechanisms. And so it's not as if one organization should do it and nobody else does it. This is a problem that all organizations need to face. And in terms of OECD, I mean, think about the importance of education here, the importance of digital literacy, the importance of in a sense, upskilling and creating readiness in society so that impacted citizens, people everywhere, can be able to understand how and when their data is being used, if they're subject to algorithmic decision making. If we don't have an educated and data literate public, we simply won't be able to, as I said in my remarks, take the reins of the technology. Also in science, AI is an innovation spawning and general purpose technology. And it will affect not just one science. It's not just life sciences or physics. It's going to affect every science. And for this reason, we really need to think about research equity. We need to think about the way that science is being developed. Are all member states, regions of the world able to access the kinds of innovation mechanisms that AI is providing that will advance the people who live there? And so these, just as 2 examples, these are really important components which make this this recommendation about the ethics of AI extremely appropriate for something that's being engaged by UNESCO.
Thank you very much. We are going to reach to an end. Just to complement on your question. Okay, I come back to you in 2 seconds. But there's a microphone here. I don't know if you want. Just to complement, just to make sure that, just to make it clear, indeed, it's the widest and broadest conversation on AI ever. More than 50,000 contributions for over 193 countries in the world over the last 4 years. So indeed, it is part of an answer to what you said about the overlap and so forth. There will be the very last question, and don't worry. After we can take all the time you want, and then we have a surprise I'd like to talk about. Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. My question concern.
If you can please inform your media.
I am a freelance journalist, international freelance journalist. Well, my question is about African countries, because most of them don't have access to internet. So I think we are talking about two different worlds. So I don't know if you have tools for those countries also. What can they do? Because most of them cannot control anything. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriela, you want to take a shot at this one, maybe?
Yeah, well, I think that this recommendation is addressing the way we handle artificial intelligence, and we're trying to make it more inclusive, and we try to invest also in those countries that are lagging behind so that they can also contribute to the development and to have the capacities. What you're talking here is about access to internet, access to infrastructure, access to all the things that are required for them to profit. And the recommendation also includes comments about that, because the fact is that when we say is unethical, that these technologies are being developed just by a handful of countries or companies, because of what Alessandra was mentioning, how much culture and diversity are we leaving behind. But the other part is also how do we invest. UNESCO is the house of internet universality. We have their own principles. And for decades, we have been working to fill that gap. So we are going to be making all these instruments count besides the recommendation. It's not the very first time we deal with it. We're dealing with many other issues, the House of Education, the Global Coalition of Education, so it's broader. But in this time, we're talking about this specific recommendation, and we want countries to be able to participate in the development of ethical AI. Okay,
yes, David?
Just one thing to build off of that. It's really important to remember that the international environment of the provision of critical digital infrastructure, so connectivity, compute power, data power, data infrastructure, has up to now been largely unconstrained by the sorts of recommendations that are made in this framework. And what has that meant? That's meant that there have been geopolitical forces at play, where you have companies, nation states with network power that have been able to enter into spaces providing infrastructure without necessarily having the constraints that may be necessary to make sure that that's being done ethically and for the benefit of those people who are being affected by the provision of that infrastructure. And so we simply need to move beyond this anarchy to an international environment where the provision of infrastructure has constraints and is in accordance with the benefit of those who are impacted.
Merci beaucoup, David.
Thank you very much. Just following on from the adoption of this recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence, UNESCO has developed, along with DDB, an extension on the internet to raise public awareness, because we don't only work with states, governments, but also with the general public and citizens concerning internet data being fed into artificial intelligence. And as an extension of this press conference, we're going to, along with the people from GDB, make you a short presentation. And if you're interested, there are computers available so that you can look deeper into this cookie factory that we have set up. And I would also remind you that UNESCO experts and our guest experts are available to provide you with greater detail. So could we start that film, please?
Merci.
Artificial intelligence is the future, but it's a coin with two faces. A good one and an evil one. Both feeding on your personal data, generated by your browsing habits. Your cookies. This is how you attract on the internet. Your identity is served on a silver platter, while you remain completely powerless. They know everything you know, what you like, and what you do. And it's never enough. Without ethical principles, your privacy is endangered. This is why, at UNESCO, we are committed to defend your rights. To do so, we created the Cookie Factory. It's a browser extension that will feed other AI with fake data. With keywords and web searches, an AI will generate new cookies on your computer to lure tracking algorithms into thinking you're somebody else. All your cookies, browsing habits and history will be replaced, so you can see how much they know about you. With the Cookie Factory, become anyone you want by picking any identity of your choice. You can even create your own personal cookie recipe and roast the system on your own terms. Download the Cookie Factory extension and take a bite of freedom.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you. Now, as I said, for those who want to test the Cookie Factory, computers are here available, and for those who have any other additional questions, the team is here at your disposal, both here on the stage, and also I see some UNESCO experts behind. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Maybe we can stay, maybe we can stay 10 minutes here and then
We won't shake hands.